Good afternoon, everyone. And good afternoon from Singapore, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Saeed, and on behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies here at the National University of Singapore, I welcome you to the first roundtable of the ISAS International Conference on South Asia 2023. Today, the first roundtable today is titled Everyday Imaginations of Authority in South Asia, and we are thrilled to be joined by a great panel here today. First, we have Dr. Aisha Siddiqui, University Lecturer at the Department of Geography at the University of Cambridge. We're also joined by Dr. Malika Shakia, Senior Assistant Professor at South Asian University, and Dr. Suruchi Thapar-Björkert, Docent and Associate Professor at the Department of Government at Uppsala University. Today's session is chaired by Dr. Gyanesh Kodaisia, Associate Professor at the South Asia Studies Program here at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at NUS. Thank you again for joining us today. Just a reminder for the audience that please, you can pose your questions that you may have throughout the session using the Q&A function. And now I'll hand over the session to Dr. Ganesh.
Thank you, Said. So welcome to this session on Everyday Imaginations of Authority. This is the first roundtable which we'll have. We just had the keynote address by Professor James Maynard. And this is the only roundtable scheduled for today, and the rest will take place tomorrow and day after. You have the schedule with you, perhaps. So this roundtable is focused on the idea of authority in South Asia. It is hopefully the discussion will look at how people view the notion of authority. How is the state legitimized or delegitimized through popular imaginations? So with the rise of authoritarian politics in South Asia, how is authority imagined? So these are the kind of questions we hope we will engage with. Where does authority appear to lie? So there are three key ideas around which this panel is structured. How do people understand what constitutes authority? That's the first question. How do people imagine threats to the state? That's the second question. And the third one is, how has technology, new technology, shaped public views of the state? And how do states cultivate and manifest popular cultural power? So these are some of the questions. And we have three presenters, wonderful colleagues. One is a geographer. Another one is an anthropologist and sociologist. And the third one is a scholar of gender, originally a historian. So we look forward to the presentations. And the format which we will follow is we will follow the sequence in which the names of the presenters appear. So it'll be first Aisha, then Malika, and Suruchi finally. And perhaps we'll take about 10 to 12 minutes. Is that okay for each one of you? And then we will open it up for discussion. So over to Aisha.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and are the slides visible?
They are, yeah.
They are, yeah. Right. So what I thought I'm going to do, because it's difficult to kind of provide a lot of kind of context and nuance and really get into the depth of an argument in 10 minutes. I'm going to present kind of two broad puzzles around the everyday state in South Asia, focused on my research. And we can have a broader conversation on the two puzzles that I present in the Q&A, if that's something of interest. So just to provide a little bit of what this work is based on, I did field work on flooding in Pakistan. So Pakistan was affected. Our kind of temporal visions are quite short. When Pakistan was affected by flooding in 2022 last year, everyone said this is unprecedented. This has never happened before. But actually, large-scale flooding in Pakistan around the Indus Basin happened quite frequently and quite regularly. So the ones before 2022 were in 2010 and 2011. And if you look at the south of the country, in the province of Sindh, that's where I did fieldwork across 3 districts, and it was fairly ethnographic and kind of long-term fieldwork with communities who had been affected by this flooding. And what I really wanted to understand through the course of, and the reason I've kind of put 2 discrete pieces of work there is because I'm drawing on these 2 discrete pieces of work to say, to kind of talk about what I wanted to do through the lens of the flooding or the analytical window of the disaster was to get a better sense of how do people understand the state? What do people think of the state? What are these everyday interactions with the state? But I was using the lens of the disaster. How do people expect the state to respond in the aftermath of the disaster? What do the people make of this entity? What I want to say about the first puzzle, which I actually don't get into much depth in my own work, is, but I think it still holds and it still stands, and I think it is something that confounds to some extent, is that the encounters with the state, the everyday interactions with the state, they continue to fall short of what people believe the idea or the abstract of the state is. And yet that idea of the state, that kind of larger than life entity, that lives on, right? And again, it's a little bit challenging to get into real kind of ethnographic depth here in the short period of time that we have. But what I've said in my work, where there is a little bit more kind of fleshing out of this idea, is that in the time that I spent doing field work in these smaller second-tier kind of cities and towns in Pakistan, what I frequently encountered was that, or what I frequently came across was that this encounter with the state tended to represent something like people going in to receive their cash transfer from the government, which the government had instituted in the wake of this flooding disaster, right? And so the cash transfer was being provided to people through a debit card called a Watan card, Watan meaning country. And there were just not enough cash points in these small towns and large-scale rural urban developments. And so the queues were incredibly long. Sometimes they would go and their number, the number that had been allocated to them, the money had not yet been transferred. So they had to return another day. Often they had to take their day off work to access the ATM. That kind of regular, I mean, I don't think that these are, anything I'm saying right now is challenging for scholars of South Asia to understand, right? There are these everyday kind of difficulties with encountering the state. You go to meet the district commissioning officer, you have to wait outside his office for a really, really long time because the queues are again so long. So that everyday encounter is like riddled with all of these challenges. And yet, despite having all of these challenges with encountering the state or the version of the state that you're looking to meet with on that day, when I asked people about who they think is responsible in the aftermath of a flooding, they would often say things like, this was a calamitous wrath of God. No one could have saved us. This was divine punishment and all of that. But then say, but the state should have done something. The state in effect, also in some contexts, and of course no one would put it this way because it would hurt so many religious sentiments. But there are times when the state becomes even larger than God himself, right? And that's where I feel that there is that kind of puzzle, that where the everyday, the regular, the daily encounters continue to disappoint. How does that bigger idea of the state, the sarkar, kind of continue? And I present some possible suggestions, particularly around the way that the state has historically responded to famines and large-scale kind of disasters. But I still think that this is one of the things that I haven't really really done justice to in terms of the big puzzles that I've talked about in my work. The second puzzle that I think perhaps I would say confounds slightly less, but I think still definitely is a tension, or is a question, is a puzzle that exists within the context of my work, is something that perhaps draws less on the anthropological work on ideas of the everyday state, and more on kind of geographical work on ideas of the post-structural state. So if we recognize that the state is not a thing, it's not an entity that operates separate from society, but that the state is in fact being produced in these daily interactions and contestations and encounters between structures, between people, etc. Then in this piece of work that I did on a particular kind of drainage project in the same part of Pakistan, in the southern part of the country, massive, large drainage project that really fails its citizens every flooding year. So every flooding year, every time the water is too high, the defenses of this left bank outfall drain are going to break, and it's going to flood people's homes and people's workplaces. So people keep producing a state that keeps flooding them, and this is kind of a circular almost. And in this work, I talk quite a lot about circularity and kind of cycles, that this is almost a cycle. It keeps happening. People keep producing the kind of a state through their interactions, through their encounters, through the contestations with power, with structures of power, with institutions that continue to produce kind of hydraulic and infrastructural failure. And in work on hydraulic infrastructure, this is also fairly well understood that the production of the hydraulic failure is not some kind of mistake or accident, but is very much part of the way that the state reproduces itself, right? So that hydraulic failure is the state, is state production in some ways. So I ask in this paper that if the LBOD and a lot of my informants in the field, interlocutors in the field, are saying things like 100% we will be drowned the next time there is flooding, 100% the LBOD is going to break its embankments, etc. So if it's so clear that the hydraulic failures are going to drown people, then why are people continuing to reproduce that state? And again, I can't get into great depth of the argument and how I've kind of laid it out in scalar form at the very lower scale within the province of Sindh, then at a slightly higher scale between Sindh and Punjab, then at an even higher scale between, or it's a higher scale of power between the rest of the country and the military. There is always this understanding that this hydraulic failure, this hydraulic break is drowning them but it's saving someone else. So this belief that the state works for someone else, it doesn't work for us, it doesn't work for Lower Sindh, but it works for Upper Sindh. It doesn't work for Sindh, but it works for Punjab. It doesn't work for everyone in Punjab, but it works for the military farms in Punjab. It doesn't work for all military farms in Punjab. There's always an other who the state is working for. And because there is that belief that this state that is being produced is working for those at the highest echelons of power, this cycle kind of keeps reproducing itself. Though I'm not entirely convinced that the state that is being produced is in fact working for anyone except those at the highest echelons of power. But that belief in that that other who is being saved by this hydraulic failure keeps reproducing that particular kind of unequal state in space and in scale. And I call that the Sisyphean cycle, because Sisyphus was carrying that rock up the mountain, and the rock, every time they came, it went a little bit further up, it would fall down, and then he had to keep carrying it up again. So I call this the Sisyphean cycle of producing an unequal state that continues to be working for really nobody, but everyone believes it's working for someone else. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aisha. We'll come back a lot of questions, perhaps, this fascinating paper. So over to Malika.
Great. I have some difficulty with the slides. Can you see the slide?
We can.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. Okay, so this photograph is a border gate between Nepal and India, which is the southern central part of Nepal. And known, the name of the place is Birganj. It's not quite right on the border, but the Nepal side of the border. And architecturally, you could see that it tries to, represent the best of, what Nepal has to offer. So several architectural designs that are cultural heritage in Nepal are all lumped into one gate, and it looks a little bit awkward. But this is the place where I've been doing my ethnographic fieldwork since 2001. Not quite 2001, but it's a connection. I moved to this location in 2010, but before that, I was working with the people from this border town who had come to Kathmandu to be part of the ready-made garment manufacturing industry, which was the largest employer during 2001, have been such for about a decade. But it died in 2004, which is what my first book is about. But after the collapse of the industry in Kathmandu, I followed some of the businessmen and workers into this border town. And since 2010, I've been kind of pursuing my ethnographic fieldwork. So the location, I'm not a geographer, so the map is a bit messy, but Birganj Point A is where the ethnographic fieldwork is. And if you see a gray line cutting through Birganj, that's the border between Nepal and India. But what I would like to highlight is that we are all used to thinking of borders as a line thick as a human hair. But if we actually went to a border location, the border is never quite that concrete. It's not that cartographic. So my perception of the border town or the borderland is the stretch where I've written B to C. And this particular line, which I call this borderlands, is connected with the Nepal's capital, Kathmandu, in a perpendicular form. So this is the shortest route that Kathmandu has towards the mainline railway traffic of India, and which is why this has been the central route through which almost entire supply chain of Nepal as a centralized state has been managed for quite a long period of time. And if you went to the border, this is pretty much the borderline, the bridge which separates India from Nepal. And I took this photograph in 2010, but I don't think this traffic has changed that much even today. Not so much because of the backwardness of technology and infrastructure, but because of the social history inherent in the place, that the practice is, if something is not automobile, or if it's a auto rickshaw, if it's a cycle rickshaw or if it's a horse-driven cart, then they don't have to go through the state customs check, whereas the other vehicles would have to be checked at the border. And so on one hand, you would see these big trucks pretty much supplying the entire oil or petrol or grains for Nepal going to the same lane, whereas then there would be this very provincial sort of vernacular travel as well. And I wanted to look at the authority, sense of authorial agency in this location through this particular group of people that are known as the Marwadis, who would be an ethnic group that most South Asians would be familiar with, and invoking them as the kind of as a form of authority. I wanted to bring in the Weberian sense of duality of the state, whereby the state or governance is maintained through an alliance between people who have muscle power, either in the forms of legal muscle power or the military muscle power or the state itself, and those who have the financial power, which are pretty much the traders or merchants, financials, and all of that. I wanted to think about this kind of balance between the traders and rulers in invoking authority through a cycle of ruptures that this border town or the border region of Nepal have undergone since 2010, in fact, slightly before. So when I was doing fieldwork in Nepal, in Kathmandu, among the garment industry, where a lot of border people would join the industry, there was very little curiosity about who exactly these people were, because they would be considered as the border people, and there wasn't quite an curiosity about it. The curiosity started with the Madhya Uprising immediately after the end of the Maoist insurgency in Nepal in 2007 and 8, and which is when the border region was put into the map. And that's when people began to recognize the Madheshi people who lived on the Nepal side of the border as Nepali citizens. And in that, mediating this citizenship, the role of the Marwadi traders was pretty interesting because they've been in this region for quite a long time, and their arrival into this region is connected with the Mutiny of India, where in 1858, when Nepal helped the British Raj to contest the military uprising, which was when the Rana regime was installed in Nepal as an extension of the crypto-colonial agency, and who then formed an alliance with the Marwadis. So invited the Marwadis to come and trade in the border towns. So it dates back to 1850s or so. The first Marwadi family who came to Birganj date back their family history to 1868. Since then, they have been very loyal to the state, be it the Rana regime until 1951, and later the Shah regime, though democratic, during the reign of King Mahendra, King Birendra, and the democratic regime. So they never quite saw themselves as pretty much the border people. They were pretty much part of the state. That changed when the 2007 border uprising happened. And the Madheshis put themselves in the map. And immediately after that, there was a really intense round of criminality. So this photograph is of people, this shopkeeper here had lost his brother in a kidnap incident. And when I was doing my fieldwork in 2010, it was extremely unsafe to be in the border region, to the extent that by 6 o'clock in the evening, no men would be outside their homes. It was that difficult. So in that context, this is the hero kind of pretty much who, control the violence. SSP Ramesh Kharel had already gained a pretty good reputation for fighting the gangsters, bringing gangsterism under the control of the law while he was posted in Kathmandu in Pokhara. So when he went to Birganj, he was pretty much regarded as the hero who finally brought law and order in this border town. And I'll talk about him a little later. because then after 2011 and 12, Birganj actually became a pretty safe place until the second rupture. The photograph is from the time when Nepal promulgated the latest constitution in 2015, which was welcomed by a large constituencies of people, almost all parties who were part of the writing of the constitution. But this was contested in the border region. So in fact, there was a border blockade movement waged by the Madhesi people, which is a photograph of this. And although the Marwadis were not part of the street protester gang kind of representation, they were strategically linked to the engineering of the blockade, which was a kind of well-known, which should be talked upon quite openly. And if I go back to the earlier photographs, these are some of the leading businessmen, some of the leading cultural activists, social activists, and one of them is a parliamentarian. The three young people who I knew as really young men in 2010 have now pretty much become a well-known businessman in their own right in Nepal. So the border blockade again kind of reintroduced Marwadis as the state allies. In this case, actually not quite the allies of the Nepali state, but the Madhesi constituency, who had gained a kind of federal state presence by then. The next kind of photo that I wanted to show is about the popular imagination about S.P. Kharel, whose photograph that I showed before. There's a film made on his life, which is not so much of a biopic, but a very masala Bhojpuri film, made in Bhojpuri language. And this is his depiction in the movie, where he's pretty much sitting in an Indian office, flanked by Ambedkar, Gandhi, and others wearing the Indian police uniform. But popular on both sides of the border as the state figure, kind of imagining or kind of deciding the state to have that essential role of containing violence, which seems to be pretty much subscribed by people from both sides of the border. And the reason why I kind of bring that up is to link it with today's context, when the religious riots, which have been occurring now and then in several Indian cities, have now expanded to the border towns. This particular photograph is not of Birganj, but of Nepalganj, a very similar border town on the western side of the India-Nepal territory. And under curfew, following an intense Hindu-Muslim riots that took a few lives, made a few people seriously injured. And this is a violence that is actually emerging not only in the western border towns, but pretty much in Birganj, although Birganj has not had to impose a curfew. Curfew has been imposed in the eastern border town as well. But in these years that I've been frequently visiting Birganj, even before the news have captured the eruption of the communal violence, the internal discussions among the people have kind of brought to the surface that this is in making. That over the years, the discourses kind of changed from we have to preserve our culture, and then following on to what do we exactly mean by culture. It means pretty much the Hindu culture, and these contestations or this anxiety about the rising population of the Muslims or intolerance. So all of these have been in making, and in making of these discourses, again, the Weberian kind of alliance between the traders and the state power have been quite important in the sense that the people who generate these narratives and then kind of to a certain extent, engineer these eruptions of violence have been pretty much the same actors who have been performing authorial agency for several decades of the time when it has gone through certain rounds of political changes. So a combination of the cultural kind of significance as having access to the Marwari heritage, the political context of being the migratory kind of entrepreneurial population with context with the state in India, Nepal, as well as in other parts of South Asia, and then access to this kind of populist imaginations about heroism and masculinity involving eruption of violence, but also the controlling of the violence. All of these seem to kind of mark what forms the social reproduction of the authorial agency in these border towns. I'll stop here, and I'm happy to join the discussion later. So now I just need to find out how do I stop sharing my slides.
Thank you, Malika. Thank you very much. Okay, so over to Suruchi now.
Yes, first of all, Ganesh, thanks for coordinating and chairing this, and thanks to Malika and Aisha for your interesting presentations. So I would like to start by actually making a comment first on how I understand imagination. And here I would like to put the point that imagination is something no longer, we could say, confined to the expressive space of art, myth, or ritual, but rather we need to see imagination as part of people's everyday lives. And it's also an avenue through which possibilities of change are imagined. And sort of drawing on Padurai's work, you could also say that, we need to also distinguish between imagination and fantasy. And, there has been, in the domain of imagination, there has been an argument that imagination will be sort of undermined by processes of, let's say, commoditization, industrial capitalism, or secularization. But there is sufficient evidence to show that that how this consumption of mass media throughout the world, not only confined to South Asia, it has been facilitated by imagination, and that has been achieved by sort of mobilizing resistance, irony, selectivity, and in general agency. And it's the part of agency that that is very important for my analysis. So one could say that imagination is, from also the presentations that we have heard, is, you could say, a staging ground for action, not just only for escape. The third point that I would like to put forward about imagination is that it's not just limited to individuals, but it's actually a property of collectivity. So if we have to imagine and argue a case for, let's say, community sentiment, how groups begin to imagine change and feel a sense of togetherness, then the argument about collectivities becomes important. So to draw kind of a sort of a circle around this discussion, we could say that imagination is an organized field of social practice. It can be seen as a form of work, and it's a form of negotiation between sites of agency, whether you're looking at individual agency or you're looking at other globally defined fields of possibility. If one was to inject imagination with critical feminist epistemologies, then one could also see, one could bring in the notion of situated imagination, which informs all forms of knowledge production. So knowing and imagining are here seen as complementary. So the sort of the feminist field, if I was to kind of without doing it much injustice, if I was to sort of bring out some points, you could say that it emphasizes the creative role of imagination, particularly vis-a-vis understanding authority, but also how it sort of reconstitutes the relationship with the political and the social. And what, of course, becomes also important is that while the experience of disadvantage and deprivation that was coming out in Aisha's presentation very beautifully, how it shapes these processes. But here, imagination then becomes the resource through which one can go beyond it, through which change or emancipation or border crossing that was coming out in Malika's presentation, how the same faculty constructs but also fixes the border. So on the one hand, imagination is creative, but it also has, when we talk about borders, it can be oppressive and non-liberatory. I would like to draw on a particular example from my field trip, which was in the Fatehpur district in Uttar Pradesh, and a particular Gram Panchayat of Uday Sarai in the Bitaura block. This was an interesting village per se. It was it had approximately 2,000 households, but significantly, it had a large population of male migrant workers who moved to Bombay. And the impetus to migrate was fueled by caste dynamics that were triggered by a social protection scheme that we're all familiar with, the Manrega, the Mahatma Gandhi National scheme of rural employment. Now, while the aim of Manrega was to sort of aid in the empowerment of the marginalized communities, especially women, the scheduled castes, and the scheduled tribes, but how it unfolds is very different in this particular village as a case study, but also just generally in the state of Uttar Pradesh in various blocks and districts. So as we all know, the upper castes are unwilling to work with Manrega because it sits very uncomfortably with their caste status. Nonetheless, they hold the job cards and they claim the money without really actually working on the Manrega sites. So these caste-related discrepancies has led to low-caste people being underpaid or not being paid at all at times. So many of these workers, migrant workers in these households, very much said, if we were to just work for 100 rupees within Manrega, which is a kind of denomination, even if you extend it to 200 rupees a day, how are we supposed to survive? We will all die. So the idea of this state here as an entity that offers a level playing field is very much there, but the idea that the state does not deliver also comes across in the narratives. Despite this, there is still in their imagination, there is still this hope and this aspiration that the state will one day offer what it set out to under this scheme. So better remuneration, which is double, something like 400 to 500 rupees per day, working as stone polishers in Bombay, is to basically make the ends meet. But one thing that was also very visible was this was one of the only villages in the Fatehpur district which was really prosperous. So even though they migrate, they leave their family states as laborers in Bombay, what has brought them together in this vision of the state not delivering is working together as unskilled labor, and most of them are scheduled castes. So when I gave you the sort of the way I want to understand imagination and how it works vis-a-vis state authority, so the migration to a large cosmopolitan city is very much about the state not being able to fulfill what it set out to do. And consequently, there is outward migration. And I must point this out, that one of the features of Manrega, or the discussions, the political discussions, was very much to stop migrant workers so that they could, to stop migrants per se, so that they could work in the fields and they could take on this unskilled labor. But that has not happened. On the other hand, if the imagination about the state authority not delivering, but also the imagination tied up with agency, enables them to earn, to go beyond that, and to send remittances back home, leading to the prosperity, there is also a dark side to this. So Uday Sarai has figured many times in the political space as the only kind of village which had seen so many deaths. Every household was in a way completely wiped out, at least the male members of the household, due to HIV, AIDS that was contracted by these laborers and brought back to the villages with their wives infected and their children infected. In fact, there were households where there were just some women left, and the rest of the family, a joint family, had all been eroded. So this sort of dark reality to when you enter the village and you see it as a very prosperous village is where I would like to say that how imagination of a better life, of a change, where agency also has boundaries and imagination constructs those boundaries to the detriment of these households. So I would like to end there my presentation.
Thank you, Suruchi. That's a very interesting presentation, raising many, many issues. May I now invite the three panelists to please come back. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And perhaps initially we could discuss if we could see if there are questions which you would like to ask each other, or there are common issues which the three presentations raise. So as I read out the panel manifesto earlier, there were questions about perception, what is authority, how do people imagine the state, how new technology is shaping perception. So all these are questions. I think many of these issues have been raised in the presentations, but would you like to ask a question or make a comment to each other initially?
Yeah, I think something that is both in Mallika's and Ayesha's presentation was the multi-layeredness of the state, and also the role of imagination, that how the state is imagined by various actors. The state is imagined as somebody that will deliver, as somebody that will act as a level playing field. But there are also sort of ruptures in that imagining, which are connected to political events or ecological events or social events that take place. Like, for example, Mallika was talking about the violence that erupts, and the expectation that there would be some kind of borders and boundaries, not only geographical, but also to the violence that is out there.
Thanks, Ruchi, for quite beautifully summarizing Aisha's on my presentations. I mean, I'm so happy that you raised this question about imagination, because as I said, my entry into my field was a bit circumstantial, in the sense I was studying the garment industry, and when the industry died out, as an anthropologist, I was at loss because my field just disappeared and I didn't know what to do. So I followed some of the people, and these people were kind of a bifurcated group, class-wise, ethnicity-wise, and in so many different other ways, right? So on one hand are the subaltern workers who had come from both sides of the border as the daily wage, low-skill, unskilled workers, who would be happy with some casual kind of employment in the garment industry, who don't have any capital. And so when the industry died out, they had to go home, which is where the border town is. And on the other hand, the businessmen, largely the Marwaris, who had been setting up factories in Kathmandu, also had to go back home. But for them, home is quite different from what it was for the workers. So now, for over a decade, I've been looking at this small border town, and it's much easier in terms of scale to understand what is happening than the case in Kathmandu, which is, after all, it's not a big city, but it's a capital city, right? So I look at Birganj, and it's interesting that on one hand, the imagination is it comes across as spontaneous, broken in many ways. There is subaltern imagination about, what might happen. They just don't know what might happen. So when, the religious riots or the border blockade or the political kind of uprising, it hits their face. I mean, the subaltern workers are the people who actually come out to the street and man the protests or animate the movements, but they don't really know that it's coming to them. Whereas if I continue to hang out with my Marwari counterparts, I mean, I sit in their courtyards, and it's quite useful because all kinds of people come to their courtyard to pay tribute, and which is their way of actually keeping track of what is happening. And they are hardly ever caught by surprise. Before I begin to read news about for example, more recently, Nepalis have been talking about the rise of religious kind of riots, which hadn't quite happened in Nepal before. The communist violence, the Maoist movement, okay, that violence was there, but it always nationally, Nepalis have had this idea of we are peaceful people, which got a big jolt when the Maoist civil war started. And now we are religiously tolerant people, Now, again, that's coming to a halt because, they have to come to the facts that there have been riots, people have been killed, there are heated sentiments on both sides, etc., but they're caught by surprise. But, hanging out with my Marwari friends, I have seen this coming for several months in advance, and which is pretty much the case when the criminality, the petty criminality about gangsterism, abduction, extortion, when they started and they ended, I mean, their take was not, we don't know why it's happening. I mean, they were pretty much, in control of, we know who is sabotaging the security in this little border town. We know which SP we need. In fact, it's the Marwari Council that approached the state and bargained that SP Kharel should be, deputed to Birganj, and negotiated with him this expensive project of installing CCTV cameras, modern technologies to contain the violence. All of these were done with a great deal of agency. So this degree of kind of dual view in terms of imagination kind of brings me back to kind of Partha Chatterjee questioning Benedict Anderson, who is the imagination? That imagination is, after all, not such an innocent, a spontaneous process. There's a lot of engineering that goes into it, right? These are just kind of my initial thoughts, but I'd love to hear from Aisha as well.
Sure.
I think if I can just contribute to that, and it's also interesting how there are tensions within how imagination is constructed, because I almost want to come at this from the opposite angle, that is someone who works on disasters and speaks to people about the state when they're really quite down and out. It always it always kind of shocks me how much people expect of the state. So I'm also thinking about anthropologists like Martin Sockerfield in the case of Pakistan, and I think not anthropologists, but Sunil Khilani in the case of India has said that there is this imagination of the big kind of sarkar who will just take over everything and solve all your problems. And, why was it not there to prevent the disaster from happening? Why is it not helping us in the aftermath of the disaster? I'm not quite sure how or why that kind of big imagination exists when in the daily everyday interaction the state regularly fails, right? So I almost see a kind of tension there where if the state is so regularly failing, then or failing, I'm putting very in very unnuanced, very liberal terms that I find quite problematic also, but just to say that if you're not getting that from in your daily interactions or encounters, then how is it that big imagination still holds? And at least in my fieldwork, I've been surprised by just how much and how regularly that big state, that big imagination of the state has been evoked. And that's the kind of tension that I find quite frequently in my work.
So a question about, the term you used, hydraulic state. So is it, I just have a clarification, this huge irrigation infrastructure, was it constructed during the colonial period? Or was it constructed more in the post-47 context? That's one question. And the second question is, who controls it? Is it really the local state, or is it WAPDA, the centralized agencies, which control this infrastructure?
Thank you. They're both really relevant questions that it's hard to get into, like I was saying, in 10 minutes. The irrigation infrastructure along the Indus River Basin was very much kind of started and consolidated during colonial times, particularly in south of Pakistan and Sindh, where I study. The large barrages, the large kind of hydraulic.
The Sakkar barrage.
There are actually three.
Three of those.
Top, there are three. There's Guddu, Sakkar, and then Kotri, which is right at the tip. All of them were actually built during British colonial times, and I've written about this in other places that this is very much part of like the imperial state kind of using the hydraulic infrastructure for particular particular political imperatives, right? Whatever they may have been at that point, whether it was to patronize particular large owners or whether it was to show to natives that they could control the land, whatever the political imperative at that point was. But post 1947, that kind of very centralized hydraulic state has continued. So it's not like with independence came a different way of managing water resource in Pakistan. They've still continued with a very centralized, very the military considers these dam strategic assets and so forth. So that centralized big state still continues. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, perhaps there are some questions here, unless we could perhaps take those ones and open up the discussion. So the first question is from Riya Sharma, who is a PhD candidate in anthropology at University of Illinois in Chicago. Question is to all panelists, whether their interlocutors sometimes distinguish between the state and the government of the time in their critiques and in their expectations from the Sarkar. Secondly, is there a perpetual disappointment with the state that is indifferent to who is ruling at present? And finally, how does the imagination of the state also have room for comparing various parties, leaders, policies along value judgments about what makes for an efficient and empathetic state? So this is the first question. Perhaps we could have a response to this, then I'll move on to subsequent ones. So it's open to all, and all three of you may, I mean, a brief response will be very helpful.
I'm happy to
Sure.
start. In my work, I have kind of discussed and the kind of different ways in which the state is evoked. So in particular context, it is the sarkar, and then in particular context, it is the hakumat, the person who is in the structure that is doing the hukum, right? The ordering of people, the etymology of which part of the state is being evoked is very much connected to what function or what kind of aspect of what aspect of the function is being talked about, right? But I think almost, and I'm sorry, I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent here, because I'm slightly less qualified to answer whether this changes if those in the ruling party are different, because all of my fieldwork took place at a time when Pakistan People's Party was in government, and I was also doing fieldwork in a part of the country where historically Pakistan People's Party has been seen quite favorably. So it's not a very good parallel, but the kinds of responses you get when you do fieldwork in Sindh, when a People's Party government is in power, is what you would expect to get in India around the Congress in particular parts of the country, right? So that's the kind of very crude parallel I would draw. But I think what I wanted to emphasize is that whereas on the state, on sarkar, on hukum, on government, on this kind of stuff, there is coherence in my fieldwork. People know what the expectations of this state are, of this sarkar are, what this government is supposed to do, etc. There's a lot of kind of clear understanding and delineation of functions, etc. Where this really kind of fell apart was when I wanted to get the opposite end from my interlocutors about, and what are your expectations as citizens, or what is your what should you do in the aftermath of a disaster as citizens. And so when I was trying to ethnographically construct citizenship, that really fell apart. And it dawned on me much later, kind of the coloniality of language, right? And Spivak and can the subaltern really speak and all of that, because actually there was no adequate way for me to translate citizenship when I was doing my fieldwork in Sindhi and Urdu. There is just no language. So I would keep asking people about how does it feel like to be like a shehri, a resident of this place, but expect them to give me a response which contained within it all of the ideals of quote unquote liberal citizenship, right? Which can't happen. And so in some ways on the state, there are lots of words that one can use and lots of ways that one can get at, what people want to talk about, how they want to talk about it. The opposite end of this spectrum of the citizenship, I mean, obviously for many hundreds of years, people here were not citizens, right? And so the language for citizenship doesn't exist in the same way.
So it's the idea that they are subject rather than citizens.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. Malika.
Thanks for sharing these thoughts, Aisha. And I think it's a very good question. It's a very thought-provoking question. I mean, thinking about my kind of, data and my fieldwork, I was thinking that perhaps words like state or government is somewhat less useful in kind of capturing that sense of privilege, or maybe a certain kind of eliteness, in the sense maybe authority is actually a better expression. In the sense, I feel that there is this general vernacular wisdom that a large number of people, maybe everybody, seem to kind of subscribe to, that thinks of people who are privileged largely, who are elite, who, even if they are on the opposition ideologically from the governing party, that there should be some kind of access, some kind of negotiations to power, which might benefit those who are completely outside of that power equation, right? So at times, these take the form of ethnicity. For example, until the time of the Madhya Uprising, the subaltern workers who I followed from Kathmandu to Birganj would see themselves as inferior Nepali citizens. They would not even claim to be Nepali citizens. They are just Madheshis, right? Whereas the Marwaris kind of never quite took on this Madheshi identity at that point. They said, we were invited by the hill kings. We were loyal to the Pahari kings. We are Paharis ourselves. We are Rajputs, loyal to the Rajputs. And so then this loyalty is transferred. So there was this discourse, and they were invited by the Rana regimes who had been ousted in 1951. So even when Nepal was kind of ruled by the constitutional monarchy, with that belonged to the Shahs who fought against the Ranas, right? And that has gone on from 1951 until, complete half a century. But still, Marwadis would say we are loyal to the Ranas, in the sense that although they are the defeated parties, although they are the ousted parties, they would still somehow be part of the state that is in place. So being loyal to Ranas is actually not contradictory to being loyal to the current state, which, to think of it politically doesn't make any sense because there was a complete regime change, right? But in terms of vernacular exercise of authority, that wisdom seems to work. In fact, there was this kind of story everybody would kind of share with me that in 1951, when the Ranas were kicked out, King Ridwan actually went through Birganj when he returned after securing this new tripartite kind of agreement that the Shah King would ally with the democratic parties, and this would be a democratic state, and the agreement was signed in Delhi. So he was protected by Delhi. So Ranas were ousted out. At that time, people would tell me that the Marwari families, they crossed the border by foot. They locked their houses on Nepal side of the border. They went to the India side of the border and waited to see how they would be received, because they were pretty much known as the Rana loyals. But eventually the Shah took them back. And since then, there have been no contradictions for them in being loyal to the Ranas versus the Shahs. And now in 2007, it's interesting that after the Madheshi uprising, suddenly they began to kind of identify themselves as Madheshis. This was a very late arrival in that sense, right? But then that didn't really kind of lead them to any suffering. I mean, very quickly they became the Madheshis with almost a stroke of luck or something. And very soon, I mean, Marwaris were kind of contesting in various quotas reserved for the Madheshi categories in public service, in constituent assembly seats, even political authority. In fact, the mayor of the Birganj town until recently was a Marwari businessman, right? So it's kind of interesting that, and then there's the second layer. Nepal went from being a centralized state to the federal state, which was legalized in 2015, which is very recently. And in fact, the administrative structures are being built only just now. So there's the second layer of state. But people don't see the municipal office, the provincial government office, which is very, very new. And until recently, they didn't even have a name for the province. They were calling it Province 2. Only last year, I think they agreed that it could be called Madhesh Province. So it's that new. So there's this government, the municipal authorities, and the Kathmandu, the central regime. People don't see these in any contradiction. I mean, the general wisdom seems to be that if you have access to anybody who has power, it could be people in the ruling party, opposition party, regional party, or kind of these business conclaves, wherever it is, you'll be fine. You'll get some protection. So that's that there's a certain degree of vernacularity in terms of how people kind of invoke state or sarkar or rajya to be.
You seem to suggest that there was a kind of a nexus between the Madhesis and the Marwadis in fomenting the kind of protests which took place. Is that impression? I got that impression? Is that what you were really saying? That? Okay, and then it go on. Sorry.
Please go on.
So it raises a subsequent question that. I mean, the Marwaris seem to have a pan-Nepal presence. They are not just confined to the particular regions like the Madhesi region or the Gurkha, what is part of Gurkha land on the Nepal side of the border. I mean, they seem to have a pan-Nepal presence. And of course, they would be concentrated in trading centers, markets, trading towns, the much greater presence and influence they will have. But why would they sort of identify with one section, the Madhesis? Of course, this is a very important section demographically and in political terms, constitutional terms.
Thank you for asking that question, because it's kind of following them through this decade or longer has been actually really interesting. Because initially, when the Madhesh movement has already happened, until that point, Marwadis would say, we are not Madheshis, we don't even, we speak Nepali, which is considered a hill language. We are loyal to the Ranas and the Shahs. So that was pretty much the discourse, which changed pretty soon after the Madheshi uprising, and when it looked like they are the Madheshi parties, which were the third largest party in the first election that was conducted following the end of the civil war, which took everybody by surprise. And I think at this point, the Marwadi position began to change. So then it is actually quite a, abrupt kind of change of position from there, within 5 years. This is, but less than 5 years, because the border blockade happened, in 2015, to kind of be the patrons of the Madheshi movement was quite a dramatic change, but that happened. And I think in terms of kind of everyday practice of power, I probably would like to also share that earlier the Marwadis had absolutely no aspirations to be political leaders or the public figures. They were quite happy being the businessmen, whereas now the young Marwadi kind of, activists have political aspirations. For example, there are two mayors in Birganj and another eastern kind of border town.
So these will be fourth generation Marwadis, or fifth generation Marwadis.
Pretty much, and in terms of their presence as the money men everywhere in Nepal, it's kind of Birganj, I think, is the place where there is the biggest concentrated presence of the Marwadis, and that's not a coincidence, because this is the biggest kind of border hub that connects kind of Indian supply chain with Kathmandu. In other border towns, there are Marwadis, but not in such number. And in fact, most of the national level Marwadi kind of businessmen, some of them have been listed in the Forbes list of billionaires, for example. They do have some foothold in Birganj. In that sense, it's quite a strategic place for the Marwadis. And in terms of, how they're also disillusioned. The only kind of sense of defeat that they would convey to each other and to researchers is that when the Madhya Pradesh was recognized, then it needed to bargain for the federal capital. And so the Birganj Marwadis were hopeful that Birganj would be the capital, but they lost out to an eastern kind of town, which has the bigger political clout, despite not having financial clout. And this is where, again, they kind of would say, okay, we provide the money, but we have not been able to provide the political leadership, right? So in terms of kind of, the abrupt changes in alliances and loyalties, this has been quite an interesting transition to observe.
Thank you. So perhaps we could move to the next comment. This is a comment by Madhuja Bhattacharya, and this is referencing Mallika's presentation. So it's about the sociological interrogation of Bhojpuri films, which is very interesting. She has also worked on Bihari migrant workers in Kolkata, and there are small film theaters in Bihari ghettos, where the Bhojpuri films are truly representative of how the Marwari community is a reference group for the Bihari migrant community. So it's just a comment for you, Mallika.
Thanks. Sorry, I couldn't hear you too well. So the Bhojpuri films depict the alliance between Marwaris and Madeshis, or
No,
the extortion of Madeshis by
it
Marwaris?
seems to say that Bhojpuri films are very widely screened in Bihari theaters, ghettos, in film theaters, small film theaters in Bihari ghettos. Also in Calcutta, where there are large number of Bihari migrant workers. And the films often seem to refer to Marwari community, which is a reference point in the narrative. I think that's what is suggested for the
comment.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
Another question, which is a anonymous question from one of the participants here. Have you observed whether discourses on mainstream social media in response to developments outside the region or even outside the localities have impacted how state authorities understood? So this is not addressed to anyone in particular, but to the whole panel. So perhaps we could have a response to this.
Could you just repeat the question?
I would. Yeah. Have you observed whether discourses on mainstream social media in response to developments outside the region have impacted how state authorities understood? So perhaps suggesting that developments outside South Asia or outside these contexts, which we described in detail, have had impact in shaping perceptions of the state. Yeah.
In my research, I would say that I think that development as a discourse is both imagined and understood differently by different actors within a state and across states. And I think that in the research data, I did not come across an extension of understanding development beyond India as such, or even comparison between India and other countries. They did, when there was a comparison, it was about how well social protection schemes were functioning in other parts of India, and how well the Sarkar, which was a very common vocabulary, was functioning well. And that was independent of who the ruling party was. It was more confined to how local dynamics and local politics was understood. And I just also wanted to add, in relation to the previous discussion, that the notion of authority also shifts, and it's so much tied to how that authority is imagined.
If I may add to what Suruchi already kind of conveyed so well, I have been kind of surprised by how technology has really spread everywhere, and that has facilitated or kind of connected social media from everywhere around the world, in the sense that everybody uses Twitter, Facebook, Insta, and if they wanted, they could go and get access to the content of any kind. But I feel that when it comes to content, I think the subscription or the preference for the content is actually quite regional, and maybe not even regional, maybe sub-regional. Because I remember long time back when the Occupy Wall Street movement was ongoing in Oxford, somebody asked me, "Oh, in Nepal, don't you have Occupy movement?" And it really made me think, because this was the time Nepal was still dealing with the Maoist civil war, which was a big thing for us, but not a big thing for the rest of the world, clearly. Whereas, the Occupy was such a kind of, important landmark there. But in Nepal, I don't think that was the case. In fact, I came back and I saw that there was one Occupy Balwatar movement going on. And I thought it would be good to get a little poster that they were selling of the Occupy Balwatar. It was a paper poster that somebody had just designed. And I remember the price of the poster was so high that I didn't even have that much of money to actually buy that poster, which is an ironic, when talking about Occupy. So it was a very elitist movement, basically, of few artists kind of acknowledging that there's market for about Occupy and Occupy related, crafts and arts and these kind of things. So similarly, now I'm kind of I hear a lot about the anti-Muslim riots, and I think a lot of that does come from the social media and media representation in North India. And in fact, I was thinking when this question was being read out by Ganesh that I haven't heard of any of my informants kind of say something about what has happened in the South. It's always like, okay, Northern India. I think maybe it is the linguistic kind of, geography that integrates the content. So while technology as a vehicle, integrates different parts of the world, I feel maybe the content, about how these vehicles are used, they have a more kind of localized uses.
And I think I would just contribute from my own, or rather just reflect. I don't really work on social media, so I can't really say based off of extensive field work or anything. But I think that Malika has raised something quite important, that definitely the feeling I also get looking at post-flooding contexts in Pakistan is that people tend to access the media that most connects with their perspective. I don't see a lot of using social media to engage in very alternative discourse to the discourse that people hold, right? So we have, if I, again, my apologies for engaging in this kind of unnuanced analysis, but if we look at it very broadly in the aftermath of flooding or hydraulic crisis, what we normally see in Pakistan is like the die-hard kind of damists who are all about, we need more dams and we need more infrastructure, and you have the die-hard kind of decolonial small voices saying, no, we need more indigenous solutions. And I think both sets of people use social media to further advance their own perspectives. I don't really see somebody going the opposite end, right? The real pro-dam people saying, let us now engage with all of the material out there on how other parts of the world are using more ecologically sensible solutions to manage irrigation systems, or vice versa. We normally see that people use social media to just retweet those posts and post those articles that most connect with the vision that they're trying to project.
Sure, thank you. So may I suggest that in the little time that we have, if I come back to each one of you to give us a kind of a theoretical takeaway from the presentation and the discussion that we have had. I mean, some of the headlines are, For example, Aisha has said that the state is everywhere, but yet nowhere, that it's very large and omnipresent, yet completely missing during times of disaster. So if I could reach out to each one of you to give us a kind of a takeaway for the participants about what is meant by authority and what is meant by the state in the context that we are describing today. So could I again go back to Aisha, and then I'll come back to Malika and to Suruchi for final sort of concluding thoughts. Yeah.
I think my or the kinds of things that I'm grappling with increasingly is that a lot of our frameworks and kind of understanding of what the state is, or what interactions with the state are, or how the state needs to engage with, reach out to, interact with citizens, the broader kind of, which is what some of my work is on the idea of a social contract, the citizenship contract between state and citizens. A lot of these understandings are very much derived from European Enlightenment thinking, and quite obviously, this is not news to scholars on South Asia. When we try and draw on these kind of fundamentals to discuss post-colonial contexts, they very often kind of fall apart. And in my work, I've often talked about people who say that there is lack of citizenship in Pakistan, and that's really because they haven't understood the right vernacular, the right ways of engaging with people on questions of citizenship. Right? Same thing on the state fails its people in Pakistan. Again, they haven't quite understood what the idea of people is, and also I think both Malika and Suruchi have mentioned, the state means different things to different people at different times, right? So I think all of those very ethnographically informed perceptions need to speak to broader frameworks that are much more decolonial and much less influenced by those kind of mainstream hegemonic discourses that we encounter a lot,
particularly in the vernacular, as you highlighted. Yeah. Okay, Malika.
In terms of thinking about the state, I've been kind of interested in social history for the last 1 or 2 decades, right? And how much have changed. And the whole series of ruptures, starting with, as I mentioned, 2007 and 8, 2015, now this new kind of spate of violence, which might lead to something maybe not as big as regime change, but certainly a real threat to the state that is in place now, which makes me kind of, I live in Delhi. I teach in South Asian University, which is half Indian and half non-Indian South Asia. And this kind of colonial, post-colonial kind of bifurcation or dichotomy that gets kind of invoked every now and then kind of doesn't work for countries like Nepal, and maybe by extension countries like Afghanistan and Bhutan, which didn't have this such a kind of historically defining moment when the rest of South Asia were enjoying the post-colonial kind of moment. We were under a new dictatorship, right, which then had to be explained somehow. And I've kind of increasingly begun to think about this concept of crypto-coloniality that Michael Hirschfeld kind of once said, the absence presence. You're not directly colonized, so it's even more difficult to get rid of it because there's this very indirect kind of colonization, and you can't quite pinpoint your own enemy. There are no white people, there's no British, they have not left. Whoever colonized us are still pretty much here in the country, right? And maybe that kind of explains this very frequent regime changes. I mean, so then if we were to think about this major historic landmark in terms of the state change, the regime change, either it has happened so many times that we are tired of how many constitutions we've written just in the past 4 decades, right? And then if writing a new constitution is not the solution, then what is? Is there ever a solution, right? Or this notion of, unless there's a kind of global acknowledgement of, this is a new departure, is it possible for a small isolated country to obtain that new departure and also explain it and consolidate it? Does it have the power, right? So there's this constitution of people who are always criticizing all constitutions, right? And then, what is the jubilant moment? So I think at some stage we need to kind of problematize this post-coloniality to maybe assert that was not our moment, but we need to look for our moment to define where we are. That's one. And second, as I kind of earlier also mentioned, rather than the government or the state, the notion of alliance has been kind of quite important to me in terms of how I have understood, my field people have kind of invoked power. And in that sense, I really like the word authority because it's closer to power than any organizational or bureaucratic kind of, structure such as the state or the government, right? Because so this alliance changes quite abruptly, but it is also eclectic. There's ethnicity inbuilt in it now, religion, which comes as a new factor, which wasn't really imagined until very recently. Just the same way as ethnicity was a factor that wasn't quite, anticipated up until 2006. I mean, the whole civil war was about the Pahari ethnic exclusion, not so much Bangladeshi, right? So, and then there's certainly this class element, there are linguistic elements. So maybe some kind of, associational kind of imagination is more relevant in terms of dealing with the eclecticness in kind of understanding the authority or how it gets reproduced intergenerationally and otherwise. So I don't think I have a clear theoretical departure, but it's still a bit of a conundrum. But that's been my thought.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Suruchi, over to you.
Yeah, I would say that for me, the first thing I would like to point out is that imagination is under-theorized. And we need to see imagination as a way that provides possible alternatives to people's daily social practices and also sets out avenues for social change. The second thing in theorizing imagination is to see it as layered, that it's a source of freedom, it's a source of change or emancipation, as much as it is a source of border and boundaries that emancipation, for example, wants to challenge. The third thing I would like to stress in theorizing imagination is that it is very much gendered. And this is perhaps one of the most neglected aspects on theorizing imagination. The second component would be when we are looking at the intersection between imagination and the state, then I think it's, as our presentations, Aisha's and Malika's presentation were also pointing out, that the state looms large in everybody's imagination. But what is important for us to take away is that it is how the state is understood is also different. And drawing on an intersection analysis, your caste, your class, your religion, all affects the way you understand the state. So the second theoretical contribution sort of leads on from here, that in post-colonial thinking, we had a lot of discussion on the state, on challenging the state, whether we are looking at the imperial state or the neo-colonial state or the nationalist state. But what is perhaps not seen as a driver of change and a driver of challenge is imagination.
Okay, Thank you very much. Thank you. So I think that's all the time that we have, and I want to really thank the three wonderful panelists for their amazing presentations. So, and what I really love about this panel is the truly South Asian vibe. So we had, we had very enriching discussions about southern part of Pakistan along the Indus Basin, the village in the heartland state of Uttar Pradesh in Fatehpur, and the border town, very important border town in Nepal. So truly South Asian, connections coming together to enrich our understanding of what constitutes authority, what constitutes perceptions of everyday state in South Asia. So on that note, thank you very much. Thank you, Jordan. If you could close the session, or if you would allow us to basically spend 5 minutes with each other, the panelists, that'll be wonderful. Whatever is possible technically. I would perhaps hand over to Saeed, who is the MC. He may have important information or announcement to make. Saeed, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Ganesh. I think Jordan can get back to us on the technical aspect, but thank you everybody for joining us today. And with this roundtable, we come to the conclusion of the first day of our conference. And for those who have registered for the rest of the sessions, you will have received the links already, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow and the day after. Thank you.
Thank you, Saeed.
Thank you, Saeed.
Thank you, Saeed. And
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.